Hi, I'm Bob Ray here from New York. I'm very honored to have an opportunity to say a few words to you and to this gathering. The powerful message of this film is really one that I think we need to fully understand and embrace. I can vividly remember my own first visit to the camp in Cox's Bazar, the extraordinary challenges that women and children and men faced, and the candor and the honesty with which people spoke to me about what had happened to them. And this has been repeated on every visit. Unfortunately, we have not managed to solve the underlying political crisis which led to the forcible deportation. But we have, I think, been able to gather massive amounts of evidence that is different from just information. My report is information. My report is not evidence. But the information that I provided, I think, helped the Government of Canada to come up with a coherent policy that we continue to look at. Issues of accountability, which are central, resolving the underlying political crises, dealing with the human impact of what's taken place at the humanitarian level, and making sure that we're working with a broad group of countries around the world that are going to be focusing on not forgetting and keeping on top of what is a truly tragic human situation. I think that that process has educated me a lot. It's taught me a great deal about the broader refugee crisis around the world, the processes of displacement that are happening in so many countries that are not confined to any one continent, that are truly global in nature. And I really want to encourage everyone in this discussion to look at these issues, not only about the Rohingya, but also to look at more broadly the question of how do we respond more effectively to these crimes as they are happening, and once they have been done, what more we can do to resolve them. I look forward to hearing the results of your discussion, and very, very much appreciate the chance to be with you. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but it's just not possible tonight. But I really appreciate the chance to be with you. Thank you so much.
Robbie, I must insist that you join me. We're very fortunate tonight. Robbie Hart is here with us. Robbie is a wonderful film producer who lives in Montreal, and he's here working on another project, so it's very fortuitous that he's with us tonight. So,
thank you, Mary.
Robbie.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Just stay here for just one second.
Sure.
I'm not sure the best way to express this very precious coincidence or maybe divine timing. But we realized, Payam and I, a couple of days ago, that we are in fact here viewing the film and thinking about Mona and her contribution in a hope for a better world, which Payam felt and advanced. But this very night, in fact, in the wee hours of the morning of this very night, Mona was executed along with the 8 other women. So we're here actually watching this film, thinking about her memory, being able to be inspired by her example, even as we try to take these ideas back out into the world. And James asked me earlier, what is your hope for the evening? What do you hope might happen? And I was thinking, yeah, what is my hope of what I think might happen in gathering the kinds of minds and hearts that are in this room tonight, and filmmakers like Robbie? And I think really, for me, the hope is that if there's a new thought, a new idea, a new recognition of our oneness and our willingness to make the kinds of sacrifices that must be made, to think about new models that we can begin to embrace. And models don't just come about. I mean, this is like hard won to see change happen in the world. It's not like a snap of a finger and suddenly things are better. But it does take the work of individuals, and especially individuals who are willing to change the way they think. You know, the power of our thought results in our actions. We actually are our reality. Our spiritual reality is our thought. And so if we can embrace that idea that what we think matters, how we align our thought with good virtue and teachings, and then how we enact that in our life, I think things can change much faster. And in fact, they must change much faster than they have been. But I want to give Robbie just a moment.
To?
Say something.
Well, okay. I mean, I'll just say that I want to thank Payam for being such a generous person to let me be part of your life for many years, and to go on the journey with you, and to your beautiful parents who opened their home to us. So to the whole Akhavan family, and to have worked with Mary, and to have worked with Westwind, and telling these types of stories, you don't really know, making documentary films, we didn't really know what would happen, right? We embarked on a journey, very much documentary. Where will it go? We didn't know if the case would even get to The Hague, whether it would even there would be a condemnation and a verdict. So that's one of the beautiful parts of making a documentary film, and trusting in the process, and trusting in the belief that there is a better world. And in fact, there was a result in the Hague and in the International Court of Justice, which is a nice moment for the Rohingya, despite the fact that they're still living in very difficult situation and very unjust conditions, human conditions. But I thank you again, Payam, for being my friend, and for letting me be part of your life, and going on that journey with you, which was we just watched it. So thank you so much. Thank you.
So we're going to, I think, raise the screen, and we can try to do it at the same time. No, okay, so we'll raise the screen, and I'll just stand here and look at you. That's not so noisy. I can say a couple of things. So I was thinking about Payam's parents, and just the power of parenting and the power of modeling. So I just want to say thank you for your parenting. Will you stand? Will you stand up? It's my pleasure, it has been my pleasure to work alongside a few selfless souls in organizing this panel, by name Rebecca and Tal and Jess, who have very much assisted and made this possible, and along with all of the individuals at Massey who have worked so diligently, all the details, all of the things I didn't have to think about while thinking about pulling us all together. So thank you for all of you as well. And finally, welcome to anybody who's joining us online on the live stream. We're so happy to have you here. We're going to be having a panel full of really selfless servants. And the way I've been thinking about tonight is thinking about it as a night of reflection. So not only reflecting on the film that we've seen, recognizing the example that an individual like Mona can make, an inspiring moment in time that sets people off. I'm sure Payam is not the only soul that was set off in those moments following Mona's execution, and really a belief that through her own sacrifice and willingness to die for something that she believed in, that powerful transformation can happen for us in our lives and in our communities. The panel tonight will be moderated by Rachel Pulfer. Rachel is with us tonight as a mighty example of the power of meaningful journalism. Rachel is the executive director of Journalists for Human Rights. She has 12 years experience co-creating, implementing, and evaluating human rights and media development programs in Africa and the Middle East, as well as working with Indigenous rights in Canada. Under her leadership, Journalists for Human Rights expanded to 4 continents and won several regional and national awards, including a Governor General's Award for services to the people of Ghana. Rachel appears regularly on CTV News as a commentator on media, which is so important and appreciated, international development, and press freedom. She regularly contributes op-eds and feature articles to the Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail, among many other accolades. And I mean many other accolades. It's not fair to be given such a brief moment to introduce you, Rachel. Thank you in advance for caring for our panelists tonight. And let us all keep in mind as we go into this consultation, really, that we want to think about it as a reflection on lives of service, selflessness, and care for humanity. So thank you and welcome to our panel.
In no particular order. Okay, I think we have everyone. Can you hear me? Yes? Wow, it's beautiful to be here. I feel incredibly humbled and honored to be with these incredible people. You need me to be louder? Can you hear that?
Maybe
What's that?
try again.
Welcome. Can everyone hear now? No?
Here, this one is working. You can try this.
Okay, is that better? All right, great. All right, well, it's wonderful to be here, and I have to say I'm extremely honored and humbled by the invitation. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Rebecca. Amazing organizing skills. And thank you to all the panelists, and in particular, thank you to Payam for all that you have done and given to the world. It is quite powerful to see that on the screen like that. So thank you. It's my privilege to be able to introduce this incredible panel. And I tried to find a good way to be succinct with these amazing bios, but you're in for a real treat with this discussion tonight. We have some incredible people on the stage. I'm going to start with Bob Watts, who's just over here, the former interim executive director of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Also served as the Chief of Staff to the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Phil Fontaine. Currently Vice President of Indigenous Relations at the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, an adjunct professor and distinguished fellow at Queen's University, the chair of the Downey-Wenjack Fund, as well as Reconciliation Canada. He is from the Mohawk and Ojibwe Nations, currently resides at Six Nations Reserve in Ontario, and is of the Bear Clan. Farida Deif, who's at the end there. She is the Canada Director at Human Rights Watch. She monitors human rights abuses in Canada and advocates for a rights-respecting Canadian foreign policy. And prior to joining Human Rights Watch, she worked at the United Nations with UNICEF, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and UN Women. Dr. James Urbinsky, a professor and the inaugural director of York University's Donnelly Institute for Global Health Research. I'm not sure I pronounced that right. Dr. Orbinski has worked to provide medical humanitarian relief in situations of war, famine, epidemic disease, and genocide with Médecins Sans Frontières, and was elected international president and also accepted the Nobel Peace Prize in 1999 on behalf of MSF. He also co-founded Dignitas International, which works on HIV and AIDS-related issues in Malawi and with First Nations communities in Northern Ontario on community-based interventions for diabetes. Marzieh, Darling-Donnelly, in the center here, very appropriate, is a student from Canada working to direct her future toward the service of humanity as a speaker at the United Nations, at COP26 last year, and as a delegate to an upcoming high-level political forum at the United Nations. In discussion and action, she hopes to offer her and other youth's views in more intergenerational spaces such as this one. Lastly, but by no means least, Payam Akhavan is Senior Fellow at Massey College, a member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague, Special Advisor on Genocide to the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, also serves as Senior Advisor to the Ministry of Global Affairs in Canada on the Flight PS 752 tragedy, a Senior Fellow and Canadian Co-Chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, and co-founder of the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center. Incredible group of people. So let's get on with it. Thank you all for your amazing service to humanity, and I can't wait to hear more. It's a real honor to moderate this discussion, which is inspired for me by the name of the documentary, In Search of a Better World. I grew up in sub-Saharan Africa during apartheid. The notion that better is not only possible, but necessary, is something I learned very early on. Ever since my mother told me I could not take my friends who were black out for lunch when I was a kid because I was white, they were black, and it was against the law at that time to share a table in a restaurant. Better has happened in South Africa. Not perfect, but better. Those awful laws have been repealed. We're here to have a conversation about better. Specifically, I'm going to be asking the panelists each what better looks like to them, how we can get to better, and how to build and reinforce the global institutions and actions that we need to take to ensure we get to better before it is too late. And by too late, I'm talking about the maybe 10 years we have left to change course on climate change. I'm a realist and a pragmatist, and what I've seen in 12 years of working with journalists for human rights is that the Baha'i concept of oneness, of a common humanity in which my concerns are necessarily and joyfully also your concerns, is strikingly similar to the South African concept of Ubuntu. I am because you are. What really matters is how we take care of the relationships, the space between us. And what I've seen in working across all these different places is that the principle of ensuring that everyone has access, fair and equal access to their human rights, can be dramatically affected by what people in a society believe to be not only possible, but realistic and necessary. If you change the frame of what a society understands to be not only possible, but realistic and necessary, we can change societies for the better. JHR, Journalists for Human Rights, does this through public narratives, training journalists to center human rights in coverage. In the film, what really struck me, amongst many other things, was Payam's comment that up until 1899, issues between states were resolved through brutal wars. Now, our global frame on this has changed. Many of those issues, as we saw in the film, are resolved through international law. That is progress. So jumping off that point, I would like to start with you, Payam, and ask you where you see evidence of further progress towards better human rights outcomes in and through our global institutions of justice. What do we need to strengthen? And where should we be paying most attention when it comes to establishing questions of just human rights outcomes globally? Starting with the progress.
Thank you, Rachel. I just want to take this opportunity before addressing your question to thank Mary and Robbie as well, because the journey that we had together over those 3 or 4 years is truly unforgettable. To experience those things together, to go into those camps, to hear those stories, and it relates in part to your question, their ability to convey the grim realities while not losing sight of the humanity of the survivors is something exceedingly difficult. And I'll be honest, I didn't think it could be achieved, but they've done a wonderful job. So thank you, Mary and Robbie. And one last point which I must make, because in the audience are some wonderful people who've been an integral part of my life. and many of them have a lot of compromising information about me, so I'm going to be very nice to them this evening. But I must say that one person in particular, Jack Lenz, where are you, Jack? Is Jack in the audience?
He's up there.
There we go. So Jack Lenz is the man that took the story of Mona and transformed it into Mona with the Children, which allowed her voice to reach millions of people. And were it not for Jack, that journey would not have happened. And it's a wonderful way to realize how each of us can touch other people's lives and make a profound difference. And the fact that 39 years to the evening of Mona's execution we're here, I think says a lot about our resilience and the hope that we can have in transforming these incredibly painful experiences for the greater good. So thank you, Jack, for having brought me on that journey. Now, this was a way of avoiding your question, Rachel, because my
Big
answer
question.
will depend on my mood on a given night. But I think it's obvious that we have global problems, but we don't have the global institutions with which to address them. It's blindingly obvious, but in the academy, in the corridors of power, these are highly controversial issues. And when you raise something as simple as that, people will say, you're so naive, you're unrealistic. And I was speaking with Marzieh just yesterday, and she was saying, we need to redefine what realism means. And I think that's the answer. We need to understand that it's entirely unrealistic to continue business as usual. Because I could sit right now with some of my colleagues here and in half an hour draw up a nice plan of reform for the United Nations. That's not the problem. The problem is the lack of political will. You have political elites that are myopic, that are articulating interests in very narrow, short-sighted ways. And then you have the apathetic public. And for the most part, people don't care, and that's the sad reality. So getting back to the International Criminal Court, how did the International Criminal Court come into being? Well, in part because of the atrocities in Yugoslavia. And so much of institution building is calamity-driven. We have to see something horrific to wake up and say, we cannot continue business as usual, we need new institutions. And then it's forgotten. And now we have Ukraine, and God knows what we're going to have tomorrow. And climate change, to me, is the game changer. Because nature doesn't care what we think. And climate catastrophe is an absolute certainty. So the only question is, do we have the political will, the vision, to bring about a radical transformation of our entire way of life and civilization, or will we be forced to do so after unimaginable catastrophes? So I think that we have no time to waste in awakening to the reality that creating global institutions is not a luxury, it's a matter of survival. And one last point which I wanted to make, which relates to this, when it comes to genocide, I've spent my career prosecuting war crimes and crimes against humanity, but I would be very happy if I would lived in a world where I was unemployed. Because the best world is the one in which genocide does not happen. The measure of success is what doesn't happen, what doesn't make CNN headline news, what doesn't end up in the agenda of the UN Security Council. And when you look at the anatomy of every genocide, from Nazi Germany to Bosnia to Rwanda to the Rohingya, you see that all of these crimes were a long time in the making. There were multiple opportunities where instead of wishful thinking, we could take preventive measures. So it's famously said that the Holocaust did not begin in the gas chambers, it began with words. And there's something very promising in that, because without the dehumanization of other people, these great evils can never be committed. So we need to realize that our own choices are profoundly important. The relations that we have within our families, our communities, our places of work, ultimately are reflected in the wider world of global politics. And that, I think, is a very non-expert opinion, because I've come to the realization that the problem is not expertise, the problem is not that nobody has a blueprint, but we need to create social movements with a profound sense of empathy, with a global vision, and that is the essential fuel that has to move us forward.
It's an amazing thought. Jumping off of the idea of creating social movements that can then bring in that kind of reform, not through experts, but through social pressure and people realizing that they want a better world. Farida, you work to advocate for a human rights respecting foreign policy in Canada. Can you describe how that works and how the average Canadian can get more involved in the kind of work that you're doing, what you see, where you see hope in the work that you're doing?
No, thanks very much for the question, and wonderful to be here with all of you tonight, and with Payam especially. So a rights-respecting foreign policy for us, really, when you think about the atrocities that we sort of experienced and witnessed in the film, and the kind of unspeakable horrors that victims have experienced, the work that I do is really to advocate for the Canadian government to use every tool at its disposal, economic, diplomatic, targeted sanctions, etc., to ensure that there's some level of justice and accountability for those crimes, that those who are complicit in those crimes, that are implicated in those crimes, have sanctions against them, and so really kind of to ensure that there's adequate response to those issues. I think for many Canadians, we've witnessed what's happened in Ukraine with horror, but I think in some ways with pride in terms of the Canadian government's response. Really, everything from resettlement of Ukrainian refugees to support of the International Criminal Court and its efforts to investigate those crimes, targeted sanctions against those implicated in those crimes. And so that, for me, should be, not the exception, but the rule in all of these types of cases that we've seen over the past few years. And if we do this well, if it's meaningful, I think we could do it in the same way that, Payam does it in the film, with humanity, with humility, and really kind of ensuring that the voices of victims are front and center to those efforts. I think, international justice happens not just in the courtrooms in The Hague, but also, within, with victims, with ensuring that those victims' voices are heard, that they're kind of front and center of those processes. And so for us, that's kind of the hope in our advocating with the government to ensure that they use political capital when it's necessary, that they show moral courage, and it's not always a given that happens in every country context. And so our effort is really to push where we see those gaps and where those lacks are happening.
So Ukraine could then become hopefully a model for other situations like Afghanistan, for example, where we've seen a very different response thus far.
Yeah, and in many ways, I think the double standards there are clear to many people. I mean, I think we've seen whether, we had Tigray and now and with Afghanistan, there's been a very robust response to Ukraine, which is warranted and important. But yet we don't see that level of response everywhere, and we do see political dynamics at play that are hindering efforts. We see governments that obstruct investigations at the International Criminal Court of their allies. We just this past week, unfortunately, at the UN Human Rights Council, there was a statement led by the United States that Canada signed on to that really kind of diminished the work of a commission of inquiry established to look at crimes in Israel-Palestine and look at all parties to the conflict in those crimes. And so there's a lot of work that's still that needs to be done to ensure that there is that really kind of robust response to all country situations, to all victims.
Thank you so much for doing that work. You're doing it on behalf of all of us, so thank you. Bob, this one's for you. Your work has contributed directly to strengthening Canada's commitment to Indigenous rights here at home. The papal apology has taken up a lot of airspace this year, which, not a bad thing. And I don't want to diminish that. But what else can and should we be doing, individually and also as a society, to ensure Indigenous rights are not only discussed and reported on, but also enforced, upheld, and protected?
Is this working? Great. Well, first of all, I just want to acknowledge that that beautiful film. It was so moving, and I just feel so so honored to be part of such a distinguished panel. So, yeah, miigwech for inviting me here. You know, the papal apology is one of several apologies from churches. So I don't want to leave out something like the Anglican apology, where the primate said to survivors and to their families, "We failed you, we failed God, and we failed ourselves." And you know, those three little sentences, I think, just have so much power in them. And hopefully, you know, what the Pope said will continue to resonate. And he'll come here and find other ways of not just apologizing, but acting upon that apology. We've seen other apologies. We've seen the apology by Prime Minister Harper, and one of the things he said, we talked about a couple things, but one is the policy of Canada to kill the Indian and the child. And secondly, that survivors and their families have carried this burden for far too long. It was more properly the role of Canada to do that, and that really hasn't happened. So that idea of not having to apologize twice for the same thing is pretty powerful and maybe actually needed. Other things that we can be doing, we have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that gave us 94 incredible calls to action that impact on every part of life in Canada and every person in Canada. It's not a very long read, those 94 calls to action, so I'd encourage all of you to read those and find your own, as Gord Downey from the Tragically Hip would have said, your own reconciliation. Because thought is one thing, action is quite a different thing. And I think there's things that we can be doing individually, as families, as communities, and as a country to move forward on the question of the human rights of Indigenous people. The TRC examined what was a mass human rights violation of children. Mass human rights violation of children. Pretty unique in the world in terms of the work of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. We had a second commission that looked at murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, which talked about an ongoing genocide in Canada. I know Payam and I, but we won't have an academic discussion about genocide, but let's just say terrible things have happened and continue to happen. And we're all part of the solution for stopping those things from happening. You know, in the film, a couple things stood out to me. One was that idea about sort of the catharsis of being able to talk, and maybe even the idea of talking as justice, or maybe the idea of healing as justice. But I know for many Indigenous people that I talk to, it's justice is what's being sought. And that's something that's within our hands to do. It's something, when we're talking about global institutions, that we can start by building a national institutions here in Canada that can be a symbol to the entire world. I know in talking with my friend Justice Akabuchi, who led Canada's efforts when we negotiated the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, he said he gets calls from people all over the world saying, how are you able to deal with some of these really gut-wrenching and tough issues here in Canada, and to do it in a way that is dialogue-driven for the most part, but has diplomacy and humanity and dignity at its core. So I think there's things that we have going for us as a country where we can move on these issues. We have Indigenous thought that can help us. We have the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, which I always thought was some sort of simple hunting ground agreement. And one of the elders said, no, really, it's a global economic model. And And if I had time, I'd tell you about the global economic model, but it's really based on this idea of sharing and love and humility and respect and caring for the earth. Because as we take care of her, she takes care of us, which starts to think about both the relationship of all of us as human beings, but all of us with the earth. And thinking about how can we leave this place a better place for the next generation, next 7 generations. What type of thinking and what type of models do we put in place so that we're creating an incredible legacy for our great-great-great-grandchildren. So those are things that we have here and that we can build upon. We have lots of work to do too. I have a very simple model in terms of thinking through decision making, and that's those things that are symbolic, those things that are substantive, and those things that are systemic. And we're pretty good at symbolism, oftentimes. And not that there's something wrong with symbolism. One of the definitions I saw of symbolism was it's something visible that helps you understand the invisible, which I think is really, really interesting. But if we get stuck at symbolic, then it becomes performative. And, I was telling an elder about this, and he goes, you know what? He said, if there's 3, there's got to be 4. You only got 3 S's there. I said, oh, okay, what's the 4th? He said, you go and figure it out and come back and tell me. That's the way elders give advice. And so I thought about it quite a bit, and I came back. I said, the 4th is spirit. Because it's spirit that's going to drive all those things. And he goes, yeah. And so no matter what we can do at a national level or regional level, it's spirit that's going to drive those things. And all of you are spirit. So it requires all of us standing shoulder to shoulder, holding hands that are going to make that change, because it takes spirit to drive that. It takes spirit to make the medicine wheel turn. It takes spirit to take care of the earth in a manner that's going to be a great legacy for our future generations. Miigwech, Nyawagoa.
Thank you for that. That was most profound. Dr. Urbinski, and I'm going to pass you this mic after, just to make sure we can actually hear you. You come to this question of how to build better, how to build a better world from the world of medicine, and ongoing work building organizations to help reinforce and protect human rights through health worldwide. What do you think we've learned as a global society? We've been grappling with a global problem. We all are facing COVID-19. Where do you see opportunity to build from that? What have we learned, and what can we do better as a result of that learning?
Well, I think I'll just pass the microphone. I don't have a very clear answer to that. But what I can reflect on is what I've learned. I think, excuse me, I think today we're now living through what we hope will be the tail end of a global pandemic. It may not be. That's certainly a possibility. We're also at a point where we have major challenges, major crises of the global commons. We have climate change. We have growing economic inequity around the world. We have major challenges with probably the single most important and most central challenge is the challenge of governance. And Payam has certainly commented on that, and others have as well. And we also have, I think, just to follow what has just been said, I think we have a major crisis of spirit. We've lost our ability to be humble and to absorb and celebrate the beauty of life that we are part of. And we've lost I feel very much, we've lost our footing, our ability to stand firmly and humbly in relation to the beauty of the world that we are in. I also think that, when I just sort of reflect on the issues that were beautifully illuminated in the film. And thank you again, Mary and Robbie, for a truly extraordinary effort and successful effort at storytelling. I think one of the things that's very clear to me, and just drawing on my own experience and reflecting on the film, is that human beings change collectively, most often through crisis. And the question, the film alluded to the creation of the International Court of Arbitration in 1899, I believe it was. And that came out of a century of imperial crisis, of imperial conflict. Then we had World War I, and that led to the creation of the emergence of the League of Nations. Then we had World War II, and that led to the emergence of the United Nations. And all of the beautiful ideas that are embodied in the Charter, in the conventions, and in the peripheral agreements associated with the creation of the United Nations, including the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. And here we are now, 75 years later, with multiple converging crises that are upon us, with institutions that are outdated, with ways of doing things that are now rooted not in that humility and in that desire to build a better world, but that is rooted in a very much a kind of a me-centric, short-term avoidance kind of paradigm. So I've learned that crisis actually matters, and crisis is, for many, is opportunity. It's an opportunity to readdress, to reconfigure, to reimagine, and to begin again the project that collectively we're capable of. That's probably the first and most important thing that I would suggest. And then the second is that the incredible importance of nurturing. And nurturing, by nurturing I mean education, but I also mean parenting, and I also mean building and supporting that interstitial kind of space that is our community, right? That is our society, those informal activities that are fundamental to our sense of being and belonging together. And then I think the third thing that I've learned over many, many years, and it's a hard lesson, but I've learned it, the global is very important. These global ideas, these global frameworks, these global visions are extremely important. But it's always the particular that matters the most, right? So every single act of potential growth, every single act that takes advantage of crisis as opportunity is rooted in the particular, right? In the very specific. The particular, for example, of an unmarked grave, when we speak now of the discoveries of the thousands of children, of Indigenous children who were abandoned willfully, who were let to die willfully, and in some cases were actually killed willfully. This is particular, right? And it's these particular things that allow us an opportunity to discover the power of engagement, the power of engaged learning that comes through that nurturing, right? And this is why education is so important. This is why parenting is so important. That the things that are imparted, the knowledge, the tools, the skills that are imparted, that can then be applied at that moment of crisis. And the last thing I'll say, you know, Mary had talked before with me and my old professor, Professor Craig Scott, one of the just highly influential people in my life, Craig, by the way. She was talking with us about what she wanted to come out of the evening, and she talked about the importance of thought, of words, that thought leads to words, leads to action. And I think she's absolutely right. But I would add one other, and it's probably the most important for me, which is the beginning, which is to sit in silence and in humility. Then let your mind do what it does with what it learns from that space, that place of silence and humility. And I really feel, and I've learned this the hard way after many difficult experiences over life, that that is the most important thing. Because what comes from that is clarity, absolute clarity about what values matter, what choices that your mind will pursue, how that will be influenced by what you experience in that place of silence and humility. And a place that in its most essential allows you to be filled, and I'll just stop here, but allows you to be filled truly with the beauty of the world. It is a beautiful world. It truly is. And there are many, many terrible things, genocide among them, right? But we cannot possibly approach those terrible things with the tools that you talked so eloquently about, and with the accountability structures and so on, unless we have a sense of where do we want to go, who do we want to become, and who can we become. And I think that comes from that place of silence and humility. And I think those are the things I've learned.
Thank you for that amazing answer. Much appreciated. Last but certainly not least, I want to ask you, Marzieh. You are inheriting this beautiful yet also broken world. You are stepping into it confidently. I certainly was not speaking at the UN or COP26 when I was your age. And I'm just curious to hear from you. What do you and your generation need from this generation and older generations to be set up for success so that we can preserve and replenish that beautiful world instead of destroying it?
Oh boy, I'm last, so I better have something really insightful to say. Firstly, I do want to say I've looked up to every single one of these individuals in the past and present, and so I did feel a lot of imposter syndrome because I just turned 18. And so my life experience is very limited, and my credibility is as well.
Never say that. Please never say that.
But I do think by saying that, I kind of deny what every other panelist has said so far about the importance of the individual in these global issues. And by stumbling into the positions that I've stumbled into, and it has been stumbling, it's been an accident, and somehow I've ended up in these extraordinary situations. I've really been able to interact with youth on all levels of society, whether they're youth at the very kind of top of the social justice chain and they're, speaking with political officials and they're speaking in the main high-level forums of the United Nations, or whether they're just people who are doing very important grassroots work here. But in general, there's a very intense and very justified feeling of both hopelessness and anger. And I think my dad once said of this anger that it's righteous anger that can be utilized as a crisis to turn into action. And I think what Mona said, I'm a Baha'i, and as a young Baha'i girl with a very active voice, for better or for worse, I was taught the story of Mona, and she really did advocate that youth use their entire purpose for the betterment of the world. And I think this feeling of hopelessness is driven by media, and it's driven by political officials that we cannot trust, saying that the changes that youth are really advocating for, whether that be global governmental institutions that are reformed so they don't have the flaws of our nation-state dependent institutions right now, or whether that's just moving towards a more climate resilient future, told that those are over-idealistic visions. And I was talking to Payam yesterday about this idea of being realistic and how it is often used in a very negative sense. When you're told to be realistic, you're trying to achieve something that hasn't been achieved before, and people are telling you to pipe down. But each of these examples we've heard, whether it's World War I in the creation of the League of Nations, or World War II in the creation of the United Nations, or even just the extreme progress we've seen in this last century, because you think about the 19th century and you think about centuries before that and the amount of conflict we had. And then in the middle of the 19th century, there's just this boom of an idea of peace and of oneness. And that in itself is a huge accomplishment. And all to say that I think as individuals, this hopelessness, and as youth especially, is weighing down action. How can you act when you don't think there's any hope? When in reality we've transcended insane crises at every point in our history, and what those crises have created are solutions. And now we're at a point where we have insane opportunity because there's global crises layered on top of each other. And the bigger the crises, the bigger the opportunity. And we're being presented with multiple opportunities in a row to, one, as individuals, take action into our own hands, because every change is driven by a social collective. And two, through the social collective, we can advocate for structures to be reformed so that global problems have a global solution. It's not a big idealistic vision, it's the natural next stage of our evolution. So I think, as every other panelist has said, individuals do drive change, and our actions are very important. And every youth I've spoken to kind of has to take on this responsibility now, because there's a time limit on change and our ability to change. So as individuals, recognize that this is actually not over-idealistic. And this film proves the effect that one individual and several individuals can have on their local and global community, whether it's Mona or Payam or any of these panelists. So yes, that is my small contribution for today.
Wow. Not so small at all. But what I want to hear from you is what you would like to also see from us in terms of what is aspirational for getting rid of this feeling of hopelessness, opening up this opportunity so that young people can take on leadership roles and help to resolve these problems.
Well, I think first it's, we argue a lot about our idea of purpose as individuals, which I think I started with the Mona thing and then kind of forgot about halfway through. But that if our purpose as individuals is to better society, then you will move anything in your power to achieve that purpose. And in your places of work, in your family, or in your UN systems, giving youth a voice is vitally important, because it's kind of becoming a quota that we're filling, that we have to have youth at the table because we have to have youth at the table, and we don't really understand why, or maybe it's just because they're our next generation. But in reality, they have this really unique perspective. They have the kind of abilities and talents of a child. They have the imagination and the innovation and the idealism, or I'd say like realistic solutions to move forward, that usually, or just typically, as you grow older and you become more despaired or more knowledgeable about the world around you, it becomes harder to think of those over-idealistic visions. And they also have the critical thinking abilities of an adult. So it may sound small, but opening up any opportunity in your life, whether it's as a parent, empowering your child to use their voice, or believe that their purpose is actually to better society and that there is hope, or whether you are someone in a very powerful position, recognizing the importance of youth voices, and especially diverse youth voices, because without youth have been at the forefront of every social movement. They're the catalyst for change. So if we want to spark change, we need youth in every strata of society. So I think that's my individual ask.
Make space for youth. We have two mics here and here, And this event is being live streamed, so if you do have a question, please come to the mic to pose your question. Go ahead.
Rachel, you
Oh, and please introduce yourself.
my name is Bob Beckner. I'm a quadrangler at Massey College. It's on, thank you. Rachel, you talked about black and white children not being able to eat together in South Africa, and I'm sure each one of us said, how terrible. And then the group talked about global problems, and we must get the political will to solve them. I live in a country where a young woman is not allowed to teach school because she wears a hijab. I live in a country where a man who wears a skull cap cannot be a judge. I live in a country where Jagmeet Singh cannot be a police officer. Why do we think we might be able to marshal the political will to deal with global problems when I see no sense of outrage among our politicians about this obvious violation of human rights in our own country?
It's an excellent question. Who would like to take it?
Well, I would just say it is an excellent question, but I think it's important to recognize that we don't have to assume that we're perfect in order to pursue perfection, right? So I would say that the challenge that you've posed is one that requires, for Jagmeet Singh, for a person who wears a hijab, just as of the two examples that you cited, the challenge is that is a challenge. That is a challenge to us in our community here now. How we respond and take responsibility for truth and reconciliation around Indigenous peoples. This is our contemporary challenge in our home, in our country today. But that does not mean that because we are as yet imperfect in dealing with those challenges, it does not mean that we have no responsibility to participate in challenges for which a just result outside of our country depends on us. Look at Gambia, a little tiny country. Look at what the enormously powerful thing they did. It's unbelievable. They stood up and took their responsibility. There's massive political challenges inside Gambia, massive inequities, massive injustices. It's not a perfect state, but at the same time, it did not absolve that country and that country's leadership from taking its responsibility to participate internationally when only someone else could have stood up and pushed that issue forward at the International Criminal Court. And when I was watching that, I thought, wow, where was Canada? Why didn't we do that? Why did we have to? Why did we allow ourselves to sit silent while this little tiny country did this wonderful, extraordinary thing? And I was thinking, oh, there must have been incredible political machinations and calculations about self-interest and how will this affect our image and how will it affect our role in the United Nations and the Security Council and all of that. But that is not how you stand up for an issue that you must stand up for and for which only you, or you among a few, are capable of standing up and addressing in a particular way. So the short answer is we don't have to be perfect to pursue perfection, to pursue the just, to pursue the good.
Would anyone else?
We need to talk about a problem out there and not deal with the problem here.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I can just
Go ahead.
add to this, I mean, I think there's no question that the Quebec legislation banning religious symbols for certain civil servants and professions violates international human rights law and Canada's obligations. The issue I think that we need to be aware of is that those on the fringes of society, those that don't have a voice, those that might be unsympathetic as a victim, are the ones that are most at risk of serious human rights violations, and for the government to turn a blind eye. And we've seen again and again the ways in which governments, even those that claim to be rights respecting, that have an international image of being very forward looking and progressive, have become very creative in finding ways to violate international law. You know, when you think of the kind of laws that are in Quebec that are very much stemming from what's happening in France in terms of secularism laws, you know, the fact that in France a woman, a mother wearing a hijab cannot accompany her child on a field trip as part of a school program, that is just that it's astonishing that that happens. And what happened is that there's, through kind of political cover of different types of principles, there's those types of violations are happening. And because they're happening to groups that are already on the fringes of society and are marginalized already, it just happens again and again. And so I think in so many ways, our role is really to look at who's on the fringes of society, who's marginalized, who is seen as unsympathetic to government officials, and ensure that we're really defending the rights of those individuals. And you know, one group of very unsympathetic victims that we advocate for at Human Rights Watch are a group of Canadians who are unlawfully detained in northeast Syria. These are individuals who, some of whom joined ISIS. They have, you know, they may have been trafficked to northeast Syria. They have children there. They've been abandoned in inhuman conditions. And at the core of the government turning a blind eye, our kind of rights-respecting government, at the core of that is an unwillingness to spend political capital to do what's right, to take a principled position. And you see this in Quebec as well. I mean, you see that the federal government is unwilling to take a principled position because those individuals are not seen as part of the core of the Canadian fabric. And so our role is really to shine a light on those dark places.
Yes, of course.
I just wanted to say something because there is a backstory, James, to how this case came about. And it's not just the government of the Gambia, but it was in particular the Minister of Justice who you saw in the film addressing the court. And he was a former colleague of mine at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. He was a prosecutor. So he had some sense of the importance of international law, because otherwise, you're right, who cares about what happens to a minority halfway across the world? And you know, the Gambia has no relation whatsoever with the Rohingya. But I would be more specific. He went to Kutupalong, to the same camps that you saw, and he was so moved by what he saw that when the idea was put to him, he immediately said, I will make this happen. It took one minister in the government to make that happen. And the reason I say this is because, you know, in the academy in particular, everything is reduced to an intellectual exercise, which has its importance. But ultimately, the reason why people do things is because of empathy, because they are touched deeply, not because there's some brilliant new theory or conceptual framework. So that's why I'm saying that we've created this utilitarian culture, consumerist culture, where even displays of humanitarianism are reduced to the spectacle of, you know, celebrity activism, and even our authenticity has become phony. So we need to rediscover authenticity. We need to rediscover those profound human connections that make us understand what it means for there to be mass graves in an Indigenous school in British Columbia, and what that means for the generations of people who still have to carry those wounds with them. And I think that once we develop that capacity, a lot of solutions present themselves. And it sounds, you know, simplistic, naive, but I want to just end with one thing, which goes back to the very good point that you made, sir, about the rise of populist hatred right here in Canada. When I was asked to write the Massey lectures, it was in 2016, and as I began to write about all the instances of incitement to hatred and genocide, I never imagined what would happen south of the border in the elections and the rise of neo-fascism. And it makes us realize that civilization is very fragile. And we've been quite complacent in the West. We think, oh, it can't possibly happen here. It can and it will if we do not inoculate ourselves against those sort of currents of scapegoating. What was it Jean-Paul Sartre said? The Jew exists in the mind of the anti-Semite. If he did not exist, the anti-Semite would invent him. So our capacity to scapegoat people, I think, is something we need to be very, very aware of as we witness the impending economic downturn and unraveling of the current world system that we have, which is lamentably defective. And just my last point, which goes back once again to what Marzieh is saying about especially the next generation assuming responsibility, being empowered to change business as usual and to affect this radical change, is the famous expression that all that it takes for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. In Bosnia, in Rwanda, in Myanmar, in Iraq, in every country I've worked, it has taken small minorities to inflict these acts of radical evil with passive majorities. And we should not imagine that in Canada, in the coming years, we could not have fringe, hateful groups that today we ridicule assume power and do very tremendous damage.
An excellent point. As one of my mentors, Maria Ressa, puts it, make sure you stand up for your rights, because if you don't, you might lose them. And I think one of the points that has been stressed well here is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Just because we are imperfect in our democracy doesn't mean that we can't contribute, doesn't mean that we can't help to change outcomes for ourselves and for others that make things better than a situation where a white person and a black person couldn't sit in a restaurant together because it was actually against the law. That has changed, and it was Canadian international advocacy and activism, in part the government of Brian Mulroney, that helped to push sanctions against the government of South Africa at that time. And there will be opportunities, and there are currently opportunities for Canada to show that kind of leadership here, to your point, on these issues, and then also internationally to Farida's point, for example, on holding the government to its standard on Ukraine for all other crises, to try and ensure that we have more agile responses for refugee crisis, for example. But we have, you've been standing for a while, and then we're here.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Dan Dalderman. I'm a psychologist here at U of T. I oscillate, as probably everybody does, between hope and despair, and I appreciate very much that you have spoken to the hopeful parts of me tonight greatly, and I am deeply grateful for that. I'm going to ask you a question from the despair part, though. It wasn't supposed to be funny, but so if we have 10 years left, plus or minus whatever, that's 2.5 election cycles, right? 2.5 election cycles is not very much. 2.5 election cycles ago, we haven't made a lot of progress since then, especially on climate change. We've made negative progress. So Noam Chomsky has written very persuasively, at least persuaded me, that the vast bulk of government policy that gets implemented and enforced is corporate driven. The very, very little government policy gets passed and implemented that goes against corporate interests. Ukraine versus Palestine, the disparity and the global response to those two things is one of the best examples of that I could come up with. Ontario's environmental policy is another one. And so I truly believe that the key crisis at the logistic level is one of governance, as several of you have talked about. And I am quite lost as to how we decentralize the governance system enough so that power is actually downloaded to the people and not to the corporate class. And how, what can you speak to that? And can you speak that in a way that's realistic, in the truest sense of the word, for the next 10 years, for 2.5 election cycles? Thank you.
How do we decentralize power effectively and quickly enough so that we take the necessary action to avert climate change, for example? Any takers?
Well, look, I don't have a specific answer, but I will say a couple of things. One is, I think the most important thing is to first recognize the power that each of us have, right? We have it. It is in us and it is among us. So, and that's very, very important. It's also important to recognize, at least in my view, as I reflect on how political systems, and particularly Western liberal democratic political systems, work today, it's also important to recognize that politicians don't lead, they follow. Right? They follow the currents of interest, whether they're corporate or whether they're citizen. And it's also important to recognize that ultimately in our liberal democracies that are still, however fragile, and I very much agree, they're particularly fragile today, the power of legitimate authority still rests in the electorate, which is to say that if we go back to my first point, recognize the power that we have. Recognize the power that we have and make choices based on that power. And what I would also say, the last thing I'll say, is that this idea that we have 10 years, I think it's actually a very powerful, mobilizing narrative. But let us remember 620 people last summer died in British Columbia of a heat dome, of the effects of a heat dome. 620 people in the midst of COVID, right? Let's also remember that Fort McMurray virtually burnt to the ground, right? Let's also remember that in Yellowknife, after 85 days of the city and the 4 Dene communities surrounding the city being engulfed in smoke from forest fire, from wildfire, all of these things tell us that climate change isn't coming. It's here. Right? We are in this crisis now. And so it's what we do now and how we respond now, how we mobilize that power that we have now to create alternatives and to push our governments to enact the kind of policies and laws that we know are necessary. That is the point of understanding and the point of action. And I think waiting for some nirvana, some ideal political phase effect where suddenly, everybody wakes up and sees, oh, this is the way forward. That is not the way human beings work. And I don't, that is just not how we work. We work individually and we work within associations of like-minded people who've come to the same understanding and who pursue actively and who engage actively to create meaningful alternatives. That's how we progress. And the only question to me is how quickly do we do that, and how many of us do that, and how many of us come together to pursue those adaptive strategies. And the last thing, the world will survive. The life on this beautiful planet has been here long before us, and it'll be here long after us. The question is not the survival of the planet or of Mother Earth. The question is ours, right? Will we be part of that future story? And that only depends on how we respond today in our individual and in our collective associations and choices and actions. And that would be my answer.
I think it's a great question. And, that idea about kind of waiting around for power to be downloaded from government to the people, I think is incorrect orientation. I think it's actually the opposite, that we're the ones that have agency and we upload power to the government. I spent years lobbying government on every Indigenous matter you can imagine. And for the most part, politicians would say, you know what, Bob, that's really a good point. It's really something I could get behind, but I haven't heard one word from my constituents about that. And unless I hear that, then I'm unlikely to move. And I said, there's this thing called the honor of the crown. Like, how does that work for you? What's honor look like for you? And kind of would lose a person at that point. But just to say that honor belongs to all of us, we're the ones that have agency, and we're the ones that can be the driver of change if we have the youth with us. Because that's where the energy is. And without that, I don't think there's change. I think there's all kinds. I think the one thing that we've shown ourselves through COVID is that the status quo hasn't served us very well. And that there's cracks that we have in society that we've just kind of taken for granted that, oh, well, that's just the way societies work. Yep. Indigenous children, 50% of them growing up in poverty, well, that's the way Canada works. Well, that ain't good enough. And there's a whole bunch of things that just aren't good enough. And I think that we've shown ourselves that we don't have to put up with not good enough. And we shouldn't. Because most of those things aren't good enough for Mother Earth, and she's the one that's going to provide for all of us. We don't take care of her, then we don't take care of our own kids. God forbid we can't take care of our own kids.
So let's not settle. Let's find our power. Let's find our agency. Every single person in this room has the power to help solve that problem if moved in the right way and engaged with that sense of spirit that you referenced earlier, both of you. Thank you. We are at time, unfortunately. I know that there are other people who want to ask questions, and I'm sorry that we are at time because I could listen to these people all night long, but I need to invite Mary back up to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you to Rachel and Payam and Bob and Marzieh and James and Farida. It's been a pleasure to be with you all tonight. I actually scribbled down, and if anybody's ever worked with me, you know how bad my handwriting is. Tell. But I just want to share a few of the words that I'll take away from tonight. Humility, spirit, global problems in need of global solutions, embracing crisis, knowing that there's solutions inside of those crises, the need for nurturing, good parenting, education, and that every small act matters, the power of words, the words we use, the importance of silence and humility. Thank you for adding that. That's important. Beauty, the power of each of us, the power of youth idealism, making room for youth at the table, redefining what it means to be realistic. That's essential. And not surprisingly, the last thing I can't read. So a major thank you to each and every one of you, and Rachel, your elegance is beautiful. I'd like to mention for everybody online and all of us here that Massey has a program with monthly film screenings and panel discussions like this one with their filmmaker in residence, Peter Raymond, starting in October, so stay tuned for that. And also we can follow Massey College via social media, so just look for them and you'll find them, I guarantee it. Alyssa's very good with the social media here. And I want to thank one more time the sponsors for this evening because I might have failed to mention one very important one. So thank you again to Massey College. Thank you to Adobe International Pictures, and especially a thank you to Jack and May Nathanson Center on Transnational Human Rights, Crime, and Security. And thank you all to each of you for joining us tonight. Can't thank you enough for being here. Thank you.